Okay. Welcome to week 6. We are more than halfway done. You all have done all the work, so thank you all for that dedication to the class, and especially those of you who made it to class today after a holiday weekend, sort of a holiday weekend. I mean, there was a holiday, but it wasn't a 3-day weekend for anyone, I don't think. Maybe some of us got 3-day weekends. Does anybody get Good Friday off, or the Friday before Passover, or no? Well, here we are anyway. It's good to see everybody, and uh, we're going to do our usual sort of agenda with homework recap, followed by group learning. And today's group learning is going to be all about handling errors and exceptions, and a little bit more on unit testing. Probably a lot more on unit testing because that's how we roll. And we'll go over homework for next week. Today, we'll go over the homework that you had last week. And I think Chong and I've forgotten who the other person is, sorry, who are presenting.
Kavita.
Kavita. Thank you. I think that, hopefully you got good feedback. I think there were a lot of folks who didn't have a chance to post their homework very early yesterday when I finally got in there to check. So if you did post late, I'll try to go back and look after today's class sometime. But thank you both for volunteering, and hopefully you're feeling pretty good about the test class that you wrote and walking through that. And I will stop sharing and turn it over to you all.
Okay, I'm going to go first. Let me see, I got to share my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So let me first go to the trigger. There was like a before insert and before update part, and that had two methods. And there's an after update method. So I'll be doing the before update stuff, and Young will be doing the after update stuff. Okay, this is kind of strange. I'm just going to move this. Can you also still see my screen?
I see VS Code and your recipe trigger handler test class.
Okay. So starting off with the first test method, I did a test for the missing values, the positive test. So if a recipe is missing any of the fields, name, active time, description, active time units, and servings, it should be marked as a draft. So I created a recipe first and gave it a name, description, and servings. And it was missing two of those fields. So this should be marked as a draft. I inserted the recipe, then queried for it again, and did a system assert equals and checked that the draft field was marked true. And it should be true because it should be checked since we're missing a couple of the fields. And then I did an update test as well. I changed one of the fields, updated it, did the DML, retrieved it again and checked, and it should still stay checked. So I'm going to run this test. So the test passed. moving on to the next one. I initially thought that you only had to do positive tests, and then after Bonnie's feedback, I included a negative test as well. In this test, I'm entering all the values, so the draft should not be marked. So I've created a recipe with all those fields, and I inserted it. Then I queried for the recipe that I just inserted, and tested that the draft was now false. And I'm going to run the test. And the negative test has passed as well. I'm going on to the next method. This is the method in which the complexity is calculated using whatever the rate recipe method returns. So if it returns a 1, it's simple. If it's 2, it's moderate. And if it's 3, I think it's difficult. So if I entered a test recipe, if the time is more than an hour, it should be difficult. Or if the servings are more than 6, it should be moderate. In the first case, it should be simple because neither of those conditions are being satisfied. So I inserted the recipe and then got the queried for that recipe again and did a system assert to check that it was simple. After that, I changed the servings to 7. So now it should change to moderate, updated that, and did a system assert to check that it was moderate. So I'm going to run this test now. So this was the test I just ran, and it has passed. So going to my handler class. So this was the one line I need to check, I guess. I have not, the rest of the coverage I've got. So there is this stuff I added a little bit later, but is there any way, Bonnie or Nadina, to say what is the percentage? So I guess it's this. So I think because I added some stuff at the end, I changed my stuff. I did have 100%, but I changed a lot of stuff before the class. So
yes, I think that's what happened.
yeah.
Yeah.
But if anybody has questions.
I have a quick question. It's kind of a question for everyone based on the class that we had last week. Is this a direct test or an indirect test of the recipe trigger handler class? I'm going to call on Kavita if she knows, since it's hers, and then I'm going to call on Chung because she's also presenting today if she wants.
I'm going to pass it to Kyung. I don't know the answer.
So I myself also struggle. So it will be indirect test.
Yes. And why is that?
Yeah.
What would make it a direct test? Do you?
Let me see if I can explain. So
I can call on somebody else if you want.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I know is like what is direct is that you call a specific method from a class into a test class, and also do the isolated test, meaning test the logic that is only expressed in that particular method that being invoked inside of the test method. And maybe someone can help with the indirect test.
Yeah, let's call on Janae. You're muted. Are you not giving us?
I don't know.
Okay, that's fair. We're going to try to get at it though. Catherine, can you help us?
I don't. I was in line with Chung. I know that if you call it directly, it's indirect, but I think I'm losing the actual implementation. Right.
Okay. I'll try one more person. Natalie, do you have a suggestion?
No, I'm
for
the
us?
same with them.
Okay. Awesome. Well, we're going to explore this some more today, but just indirectly, we know that the recipe trigger handler is should be getting evoked because it's called by the trigger, and the trigger should be getting invoked because we're setting up the data and inserting it and updating it, and that's when the trigger should fire, right? So if the trigger is firing, then it should also call that method. And if we called the method directly ourselves inside the test, that would be direct test.
So is the trigger getting directly tested because you're inserting records, or is that also indirect invoking it?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Technically, I would say that it's an indirect test because what you're doing is you're creating and updating records, and you're not calling the trigger. You can't call a trigger. It's a thing that you can't call, which is why triggers are different than classes. Classes can be called by other classes and by triggers, and triggers can only be invoked by changes to the database, including things like platform events, right? We can have platform event triggers. So something has to change in the Salesforce system for a trigger to fire. So I would say that's indirect by default, but and we have the requirement to test triggers, and that's part of why some people are stymied about how do I even go about testing a trigger, because if they're focused on unit testing and directly testing their methods, they may not ever think of the indirect methods. And the other way around, if we're focused on the indirect methods, we might not think of the direct methods. So great question. And again, we're going to look at it more as class goes on today. But Chung, did you want to show us your code?
Sharing.
Thank you. Unless anybody else had questions about Kavitas, sorry. Take that as a no, and thank you.
They usually put green borders around the screen being shared, but I assume you guys are seeing my screen.
I am seeing your recipe utility test class.
Okay, good. Thank you. So the after update business requirement were quite mysterious because there is an unspoken rule that you can only be known if you were to review the test class that was originally given. So I want to just let that out there because it will help all of us to understand maybe why I wrote that logic that way. So bear with me, it may be too abstract because I didn't written down anywhere. So there's a business requirement that wasn't actually laid out on the project description, but it is there in the week 4 homework check class, was that if you just review the last method, I'm just gonna walk it through what's happening on the last method, is that the test review test positive, no multiples. So no multiples, what does that mean is that this method check for if the after update, create a new task method, only create one task per cookbook, even there is multiple recipe connected to this particular cookbook through multiple recipe usages. So what happened here is that it created one new cookbooks and go through and create two different recipe and create a recipe usage for both recipe, but they both connected to same cookbook. So we assume that they're supposed to create two tasks per recipe usage, but if you see the assertion here, it asserts for one task per cookbooks. So I think there is some logic that preventing from creating more than one task if there's a multiple recipe usage connected to a cookbook. So I assume that that is a requirement. Also, that is unspoken. So let's go to the trigger. I used to have an after insert, but after Natalie presented last week, I found out that it's impossible to create a task after insert on the junction object. So I took out the after insert trigger context for my after the create a new task logic. And then let's go to my actual task. Because we're testing after update, I decide to create a base record using a test setup. So here it create one completed recipe, one draft recipe, and I created two different cookbooks because I want one cookbook to have already task created and the other cookbook have no task created. And I made an insert and I created only one recipe usage for one completed recipe with the first cookbook record. So I assume that if I insert the recipe usage and then update the first completed recipe, it will create one task record under oh, I misspelled it. The first cookbooks. I'm just gonna quickly edit it. So that's my base data that I use test setup annotations to set it up so I can test much later further down to, sorry if it's too long. My explanation. So I wasn't really thinking about it when I was creating this created test method, whether it should be positive or negative. But I think I did test both negative and positive together. So it's a little complicated. I apologize about that. So let me see if I can explain with the base records already created earlier. I made a SQL query against the cookbook object to call all the two cookbooks record that are pre-created. So I order by a name ascending, so I know which one is first on the index order. So cookbook index 0 have no task created. Cookbook number index number 1 have already task created. So I decide to, so next to the recipe, I decide to create a new recipe, and for the second recipe for the test, I decide to update the recipe that I created earlier that was a draft. So let me walk you through one by one. So the first recipe, I I'm instantiating a new recipe record here, and it should be completed recipe. So all the required fields are filled in, and I'm making an insert. And then I'm creating a new recipe usage with just recipe just created with the cookbook that I queried earlier. And this one is connected to a cookbook without task. So I'm making an insert on that newly created recipe usage. And then I'm just using contains allergen field to update the recipe I created earlier. So I can trigger the create task method to create a new task under the cookbook index number 0. However, there's a little complicated here. Instead of updating one recipe at a time, I made a recipe list collection where I added a call updated recipe. So I added there. So later when I testing the second recipe, I can just update them all at once as a list collection. So the first recipe that I'm going to test for create task method is being stored here right now, has not been updated. So let's go to the second recipe. Here I'm making a query to pull in the recipe that was draft that I created earlier and store into draft to update variable. And to make this recipe completed, I'm just filling in all the required field here. And then before I do anything about it, meaning creating new usage, recipe usage, I want to insert, make a system assert, making sure that this cookbook index number 1 has already task created. And so this one will pass. I'll show you later. And with that said, I'm making a new recipe usage record with the recipe draft to update with the, oops, I did something wrong. Okay, sorry. I should put that. With the cookbook number, index number 1, which already has a task. And I made an insert, then I added the update recipe, the draft to update record into update recipe, recipe collection list, and made an update. So this will trigger the task creation, and I'm making an insert to make sure each cookbook has one task created. And then it will, if I run the test, the assertions statement will pass. Sorry, it's like a bit complicated. I need to work on my language too.
I think you're doing a great job.
Thank you. Do you, I have another one that I can go through. Do you guys have any question about it? So that will be, so created task underscore test will be indirect tests because of, you're testing the method through the trigger context. And what I found about the indirect test method is it only validates your method. That's weird. Oh yeah, I know why. They only validate the line that your executions go through. I don't know if that's the right word. You know, if your record touched any of the logic, it validated and mark it as a green. So that's that.
That's a really good point, that your test data is going to determine what type of execution flow is in the code, right? I want to emphasize that point you just made, because it's a really great observation.
Right, because, you know, earlier I made a mistake, so I saved my test class file, and I do have 100% test coverage, but now my moderate here is not validated because I only ran one method after I saved my file. So if I were to go here and run all tests, it will hit all the line, all the logic, lines of logic, and it will give me a green light. So like that. So that's that. I did wrote the direct testing because unfortunately, I'm not that simple person, and I ended up making 3 different methods for after update project requirement. I don't know. I mean, I decided to write direct testing for return. What is it? No, direct testing for return cookbook IDs for task. This me just preventing, like, every you update the recipe, you're not gonna have a new task. So I'm just kind of preventing that. If cookbook has task exists already, just don't create another one every time you update the recipe. So if cookbook already have a task related to review, is removing from a trigger new data. So I wanted to, it didn't cover my unit test when I first writing a test method, but somehow it covered for some reason. But I already had a direct test method written, so I decided to add it after Bonnie commented on my GIST solution. So what it's doing is that I decided to make a map collection of map ID and ID as a key and ID as a value. First ID is cookbook ID. The second ID is cookbook owner ID. So when it's done processing this method, I have a book owner ID that match with the cookbook ID that I can create a task out of it. Literally, I made a circle to see to pull in any cookbook record with the task, and by looping through this existing task, I'm removing the cookbook ID owner map collection using any task that related to what ID, the cookbook ID. I think I said that wrong. So what here is doing is that I'm not sure I did it right, but I just literally just I disregard like anything like that was going on about this like created test logic, but I just call out same here the cookbook record that I created earlier in the test setup. And because we already know that there's a one cookbook has a task created it, I was able to, so I built the map collection here by looping into the cookbook list collection. And then I made the method static. Static, but also test visible. So I can call directly into test method using a class name and the method name. And the variable here is a map collection that I built earlier, which is the parameter that was assigned to this particular method. So then if you make an assertion, there is a one cookbook with the task, and so this owner, this is asserting cookbook ID that need a new task, because it's removed the cookbook that already has a task. So that was long. If you do you have any question?
That's a great example of a direct test. Good work.
Thank you. I'm unsure.
And yeah, definitely not easy to walk through. Some of the interesting points is that you had created a private method in your utility class so that that method could be called by the public method above, right, in order to eliminate the unneeded IDs. You didn't want that method to be used by other classes, but you did want to be able to test it. So you put in that at test visible, that annotation that enabled your direct test. So those are some really great points that you showed us as you walked through. Did anyone have any other things that they noticed or wanted to ask about from Jung's demo? If not, I will dive back into presenting and get us on to our next topic, which is how to handle errors in Apex. Exciting. We don't have errors. Of course we have errors because there are all kinds of errors to be had, right? With error handling, there's a little matrix that you can Google about known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns, and unknown knowns. What does any of that mean? Let's try to break it down just in English so that we can kind of make sense. There are things that we know, right? Like I know my birthday. I know that I know my birthday. I know I expect other people to know their own birthdays. Like that's something that we probably consider a known known. There's some known unknowns. The fact that I know that other people have birthdays, but I don't know what their birthdays are necessarily. Those would be known unknowns. And unknown unknowns are things like, gee, I don't know, who in this group, for example, has another type of date that's important to them, like an anniversary of some kind. That's an unknown unknown. I don't have any sense of what those other dates might be, or even if there are any other than birthdays. And then the unknown knowns, that's when that actually is probably also like other people's birthdays. I know that those other people know them, and there may be other people in the group who know those dates for other people in the group as well. I don't know them, and I may have to proceed without knowing them, right? So, for example, if you're working with a legacy system and doing an integration, they might know what's going to happen with that legacy system, what its roadmap looks like, and what they're going to expect in 3 months or 6 months. If they're sending you a single record at a time today, they may be in the planning stages for sending bulk data in the future. And they may not be telling you that yet, right? So when you sit down to write your side of the code, you know that bulk is an option and single records are an option. It's a thing that you don't yet know. and how are you going to proceed, basically. So some of them involve discovery, some of them involve intuition. That is, I have a feeling based on past experience with this legacy system that they are going to change in 6 months, or they're not going to change in 6 years, because like, you might have that intuition regardless, right? And then the known knowns are just the intelligence and best practices that you already have. Known unknowns could also be considered best practices, right? There are just practices that we're going to do our best to put into place in our code without having to see that that is a requirement. Okay, so all of those could potentially lead to errors, and how do we handle those errors is going to be the topic of the day. I'm not going to actually quiz you on how we handle known knowns, because I'm not sure that was specifically called out in the reading that you had. Was it? It was? No, it was not. Thank you for the nodding. The nodding helps. Yeah, and I don't want you to try to map it, because in many ways you can kind of categorize your considerations as you're writing code however you choose, as long as you pick a good approach to dealing with it, right? So with known knowns, if it's the types of errors that we know that we need to be aware of, like validating data, minimum and maximum values, correct data inputs, valid data inputs from a user interface, for example, if we're writing Apex that gets the data from a flow, maybe we want to make sure in the Apex that we're validating that that is the data that we expected. Or maybe we trust the other system. Maybe we don't have to do the validation because we trust that they're going to do the validation. So all of these things would represent the known knowns, and the way that we would handle errors in those cases would include using the add error function with our triggers and UI, and returning false or no success message if it's an integration, for example. And also we have the ability to throw standard, well, we can't really throw standard exceptions. Standard exceptions get thrown by the system, but we can throw custom exceptions. The known unknowns. So we know that there are things that we don't know, and how do we deal with that when we're writing code if it's something that we can't work out through discovery with the end users and stakeholders. So that means we want to make sure that we're handling those errors gracefully. If we have the potential to have a DML call that comes back empty, we don't want to try to work with an empty list and get those list errors. So maybe we should be looking for exceptions with our DML and our SOCL statements. What if we're sending bad data because we don't have the information about what the other what valid values there might be for all the different fields? In that case, maybe we just catch an exception rather than do the validation. And so this is an example of a try-catch block. You all might remember this from your first go round with Rad Women. I think we did a very, very little bit of it, not a lot. And maybe you've encountered it in your code, in your orgs that you've been going through. But with a try-catch block, you take that code that interacts with the database and you put it inside of a try. And a try is literally just the word try with curly braces. And so lines 2 and 3 could have a SOCL statement or a DML statement, some interaction with the database. And if there's an error, we would catch that in the exception that we're catching here. This exception is a generic exception. It will catch all the exceptions and give us one response based on any kind of exception that we catch. And that one response would be whatever we code in line 5. And then we can also have a finally section if we choose. Finally would be run regardless of whether there was a success with the try or a failure, an exception with the try. So if you need to roll back some parent record operation because the child record failed and got an exception, then you might need to have a rollback or some such in the finally, or some other type of operation. Or you might need to clean up if you're doing a object that stages data during a transformation. You might need to clean up that object regardless of the success or failure. Okay, unknowns also help us with that, controlling the flow of the execution and deciding what to do when the errors are encountered. So that line within the catch block, do we just cause everything to stop? Do we go back to the beginning and ask for a new input? Do we have to roll back other operations? Probably you're not just going to ignore it and skip over it and go on, because hopefully that could potentially cause tests to fail, because your tests are enforcing business rules, right? If there's an error in the middle of your operations, ignoring it should throw everything else off in your operations. So graceful exit, I will ask this one as a question. Ping-Ching, do you have a definition for graceful exit for us? You can make one up.
I think maybe catch the exception.
Catch the exception. Rochelle, do you have another suggestion for what it might mean to have a graceful exit?
Like displaying, what that error message is.
So catch the exception, display the error message. Those sound pretty graceful to me. Yeah, catch and handle the exception, log the error, notify appropriate systems. I've had code that I've worked with that has sent emails when there were errors that were caught, or posted chatter messages, rolling back whatever was being attempted at the time, notifying the user specifically on the screen, or even another system if need be, whoever's the owner of another system, if it's an integration, for example. Okay, now we're getting into some tricky stuff, the unknown unknowns. How do we handle things that we don't know, that we don't even know? Right now, that's an impossible question. I'm not going to ask it. How do we? What's a good plan for dealing with situations that you have no idea that you're even going to have to deal with? Well, you wait until the bug occurs, basically, and look in your logs to see what's going on. You look to see why the code execution halted, look for the error messages in the log, check to see what's going on with the DML, any exceptions that may show up in the debug logs, talk to the user about what kind of data they were working with and try to reproduce it. So there are strategies, even though it's a thing that you obviously can't plan for. We can't plan for things that we don't know that we should plan for. And then once we have the ability to kind of track down that bug by reproducing what the user tried to do, by looking through our logs, by looking for those error messages, by rerunning our test code and writing new test code, then we can look for a safer pattern. So do we need to check our limits? Do we need to put our database operations inside of a try-catch? Do we need to put better data validation in place? All of these things can be the result of a bug or the surfacing of one of those unknown unknowns as it occurs. Okay, what is an exception in Apex? I can ask that question because that's a good one. I'm going to ask Kavita. And if Kavita is on mute, I don't see the whole class.
Okay, so my understanding is that an exception, I was busy talking.
Oh,
An exception
awesome.
is kind of an error that's thrown in the program when, you know, when something goes wrong, you can throw an exception to indicate that it's not, it's an error.
Okay, so when something goes wrong, it's something that you can throw to indicate an error. Imagine having, you know, things thrown at you whenever there's an error. I actually had a class in elementary school where the teacher used a soft ball, a little squishy ball, and she would throw it when she went, instead of calling on people, she would throw them the ball. So I'm just picturing her throwing that at us instead when we got things wrong. Anyway, that's what we do. We throw messages when we throw exception messages when there's an error in our code. And that just is a way of putting that information out there so that whoever's listening, hopefully we're writing something that will catch that exception and do something with it, will actually be able to surface that for the end user. And we've got our examples here of hitting limits as something that we might want to throw an exception over, looking for logical errors, null pointer exceptions. But with Salesforce, we have a lot of common built-in exceptions as well. We have DML exceptions that are specific to those insert, update, delete types of operations that we do with our data in the database. The query exceptions occur when we're querying that data from that database. And the S-object exceptions occur when we're trying to work with data of a specific S-object type in a way that is incorrect at that time. So there are also type exceptions and limit exceptions with regard to the governor limits. And there's a whole section in the documentation on the types of built-in exceptions that you can specifically check for and do something about if you're concerned that your code has the potential to hit a specific kind of exception. If you're not concerned about a specific kind of exception, you can catch the generic exception. And if you're concerned about a really specific exception that is based on your business requirements and based on your custom code, maybe you actually want to throw a custom exception. So here we're showing how to catch the different exceptions, and it's a bit of a cascade. So you won't get to the generic exception if you've caught an earlier exception already. With the custom exceptions, you can, as I mentioned, write your own exceptions and throw them. And this is, again, straight out of our Apex documentation and shows how to have an internal class that extends the Salesforce exception and enables you to throw a message of your own creation rather than a message that is part of the Salesforce system. So all of those DML and query exceptions, S-object exceptions, these throw messages that are specified by Salesforce in the Salesforce platform, and the custom exceptions throw messages that you create and manage yourself. So we're going to take a look at the code and see how that works. Hopefully you can see my VS Code right now. let me know if that's not what's showing up. Let me know if it's too small to read. This is one of our classes that exists in our RAD package. It's called Sample Bad Methods. It's really easy to demonstrate concepts when we show you bad code. So this is what we're starting out with. I have made a change to mine. I have actually commented out line 3, which is a simple custom exception. And I commented that out because I noticed that we also had the same exact name for a public class outside of this. So this is an external class. It exists by itself in the org. And Sample Bad Methods is an external class, but this on line 3 is an internal class. And we haven't talked a lot about internal classes. It's a little bit of extra complication. So before we talk about the internal class, I wanted to show the external class. And since they're named the same, our code here on line 12, which is throwing a new sample custom exception, when it doesn't find an internal class, it looks for the external class. It kind of doesn't care, right? It's going to say, hey, do I have one of those? Oh, I don't. Okay, well, let me go find one. So it works just fine with the code commented out. So this is what the code does. It has two methods, and one of them is simply called "this is not going to go well," and it's intentionally written to throw an error. It is looking for accounts that are named Acme, and it tries to refer to the 51st item in that list that gets returned. There are probably not any Rad Women developer orgs that have 51 accounts, all with the name Acme specifically. So this should cause an error no matter who runs it in any of these Rad orgs. And the other method that we have is I add up positive integers. Okay, I get that. We pass in 2 integers and it says, hey, are they both positive? If not, it's going to throw a sample custom exception. So this one has an error that we're not trying to catch. We're not throwing any kind of sample custom exception, but in the I add up positive integers, we do throw our sample custom exception. And as I mentioned, it's going to look for that external sample custom exception class, which just extends our Apex exception class and allows us, therefore, to create a message of our own. And if there is not a negative, if both of the values are positive that get passed into this method, then we don't want to throw that error on line 12. Instead, we want to just return those added up values. I went ahead, because I do that, and I created a test method, a test class with multiple test methods to try to see how we could demonstrate these errors. So I'm first going to open my org and make sure that I've got a valid connection to it. If you get weird messages, it could be that you just need to connect to the org again, and opening it is, for me, the most straightforward and easy way to do that. I know that now VS Code is connected to the right org because it just opened up the org for me. And I want to also make sure that I've got my developer console running so that I can check my logs, because this is an alternative to checking the logs in VS Code, and I kind of like it. I can look at a history of logs more easily here, particularly when they're especially short. I do like the logs here when they get long, though, because then I don't have to download them. So I've got my my first test is it simply executes. It doesn't have an assert. My expectation is that it's actually going to fail because of an exception. And if I'm trying to debug code and I can write a test to help me do that, I will absolutely write a test to see if I can generate errors. I don't have to put a system assert in to generate error messages. I just have to run my test. So let's take a look at that. If I look in my list here, I should see a red dot for this is not going well. Sure enough, it generated an error. If I scroll up, I can see the error, or I can just go to my org and look at my logs and get a little bit more detail about that. Nothing in the debug, but let's see if I can find there. Oh yeah, right here, fatal error. If I look at, sometimes I will actually do a search for fatal, and that will help me to bring it up and see what was going on at the time that that occurred. So it's highlighted here, list index out of bounds with 50. So that value of 50 that we passed in as the index that we wanted to pull from the accounts that were returned, it's not valid. And so we get that system.list exception thrown by the Salesforce system without us having to throw an exception. So really what we want to know is how can we actually catch that? And if we can catch it, how can we write a test to validate that we're doing that sort of thing? Now, in our actual code, we should be wrapping that in a try-catch. If there's a potential that somebody could be looking for more than got returned. Ideally, we wouldn't even need to necessarily do that try-catch. Maybe we can validate the data instead. And that would be a better approach probably than trying to do a try-catch every time we do something in the org. I think Chung was asking on her gist, on her homework, she had a note about how do we keep our code short? How do we organize it so that it's readable? Those are all really hard questions. You don't want to put in a lot of extraneous work. It takes time. It makes it hard to read. So it's much better to write your code as smart as you can, which is hard when you don't know what you don't know, right? It's a hard thing that we're asking you to do. Don't get me wrong. So we want you to have all the tools possible to be able to achieve that. So you can totally wrap it in a try-catch block in your sample bed methods class and throw an error if it doesn't work. Or even better, you can use this technique to find the errors and then see, determine how you're going to deal with it. In this case, if we deal with it with an exception, I can actually do a couple of different kinds of asserts. Once the exception is caught, we can assert that it contains a specific message. So if I'm expecting only that we might have a bad index and we might get a list index out of bounds, then that's what I want to throw. That's what I want to be able to catch. That's what I want to test for and make sure that we're failing gracefully when that occurs. Or maybe I don't care what the actual words are, so I don't care if the message contains that. Maybe I just care that it's that particular type of error, that system error that is a list exception type of error. And so I can try to run my method and I can catch the exception, and in my test code I can see that that now should pass because I'm asserting that the exception occurred and I caught it. So that's a great way to set up a negative test. And hey, look, I'm doing direct tests, not indirect tests, because I'm calling my sample bad methods class and I'm invoking a specific method each time from that. They're static methods, so I don't have to create an instance of sample bad methods. I just need to invoke that specific method that I'm trying to test. So we've got one that fails because of a system exception that got thrown, and therefore it doesn't work. With or without system assert statements, it's not going to work. The next one actually says, hey, I want to work even if there is an exception. So we catch that exception and we double check to make sure it's the exception that we were expecting to see. That's negative testing. We know that there's a potential for a list exception. Let's create one. Let's look for it. Let's make sure that's the exception that we got. Now we've got our I add up positive integers test. And let's think about what that one does again. Let's go back to our class. It takes two inputs, and if one of them is negative, it throws a custom error. Otherwise, it just returns the values. This particular test class I created is only dealing with our errors, so it's only the negative scenarios. So in this case, we're passing it a -2 and a 0 for our sample bad methods. We're wrapping it in a try-catch block, and we're looking, just like we did above, to make sure that we get the exception message that we were trying to get. So in this case, if we wrote this code ourselves, this sample bad methods that's throwing an exception method, or throwing an exception, a custom exception message, talking's hard on Mondays, then we want to make sure that we're testing that the thrown exception actually got thrown, that it was the message that we wanted it to be and not some other error occurring in the system. So in this case, I can actually do two things. I can get the type name, which we did here, and we got the system list exception. I can get the type name, and it's just sample custom exception. It's our external class. That's our custom class that was called here on line 12 when we called the external class and passed in our custom message. So I have a lot of control over what I'm trying to test here. I'm trying to make sure that it was the type of exception that we created ourselves. I can also check the message is the same, particularly useful if I store the method in a variable here in the sample bad methods. So this message could be a constant that's part of this class. And then I can actually check and make sure that it's the specific message that I want for this specific error. In this particular example, I'm actually setting a Boolean to check outside of my try-catch block because this exception E is a variable that's only available to me inside the catch. Outside the catch and outside the try-catch combo, I don't have access to E anymore. So I can't check what the type name is for the exception. I can't check what the name or the message is. I can only check some variable that I've assigned those things to. So I have the exception type and I pass that in a message here as part of my assert. Assert should have two parts, the thing that you're checking and asserting, and the message that you want to see on the screen if that assertion fails. So please try to remember that. This will also help you when you go in to read the test and understand what it's testing for. You can say, oh, okay, well, we should have caught a custom exception for bad inputs. Okay, what kind of bad inputs? Let's see, custom exception on I add up positive integers looks like I only take positive integers. Oh, that kind of exception. Okay, that's what the bad input is. Like, you can get to the root of what that method is trying to do just by looking at the test method and referring back to the method. And it's true even as methods get more and more complex, both the test and the actual method. If you are putting your documentation into your test class and test method, you'll really help yourself out. So let's make sure this one works. I'm expecting it to pass, and indeed it did. It gave me the little green dot over here, And that's because we set the custom exception to true. If I wanted to be more thorough in my testing, I would have another test method that I would create, and I would probably put it in an entirely different method and not try to put it in the same I add up positive integers test where I'm not passing in a negative. And then that way I can make sure that the exception does not get thrown. Because maybe I don't even write a try-catch block, and that way if an exception gets thrown, I just fail, or maybe I do have a try-catch block and I put a system assert false in here to make it automatically fail. That's a lot again. Are there any questions about these exceptions and how we work with exceptions in our test class and in our debugging?
I have one question.
Yes.
The sample custom exception class is empty. Is
Yes.
it just borrowing the name?
All it's doing is extending exception, the exception class in Salesforce on the platform. The exception class is a virtual class that we can extend with new methods potentially if we have custom methods that we want to add, or if we have custom properties. We don't have any custom methods or custom properties. We just want to take advantage of the methods and properties that exist. And those methods and properties include the ability to throw a specific message. So we're creating a custom exception here with this message, and that means that that message is going to show up in our other system with the type name from our class. This type is specific to the class that we created. That's a really good question because it actually prompts me for the inner class. We can see how that behaves. And because this is a custom exception and it extends the existing exception, that means it also gets all of the capabilities of the existing Apex system exception, which means that I can use the get type name, I can use the get message on it, I can use all of those same methods to work with the exception because it's an extension of the basic exception. But while I'm here, I want to uncomment this and save it and deploy it. And now I'm going to expect that my last test run is not going to pass. And the interesting thing about it not passing is the location of, there it goes, it did not pass. It's the location of this test. So right now it's looking for, this exception class. Right now it's looking for this exception class to be external, standalone by itself, but it's not. When we have it exposed here on line 3, and again, just like this one, it's completely empty. It's not actually extending it with any new properties or any new methods. Instead, it's taking from the class that's being extended. This is inheritance. It inherits all of that exception class's methods and properties. So when we call this on line 12, all of a sudden it's not going to that external class, it's going to the inner class, because that's the first place my code looks. The first place my code looks is, do I have one of those myself? If I don't, let me figure out where to go and find it. And that's when it goes to the external. So I know I've got dot notation, and I know it's an internal class. So let me see if I can change this to make my test pass. So now I'm expecting to get a type name sample bad methods dot sample custom exception. And that actually is kind of helpful because probably I wouldn't call it sample custom exception here. Probably I would call it bad methods exceptions. And I might throw a couple of different ones, or maybe I want to have it be negative integer exceptions. And then it's even more specific. But right now I'm using that same name that we got in our package. Let me deploy it and see, hopefully I'll get green, because that's what test-driven development is all about. Boom, so now we've got green. So this is another way of doing the same thing, throwing a custom exception, but I actually get a little bit more interesting information available to me if I've made it an inner class rather than an outer class. I wanted to explore that because I think that you'll see this in your orgs, and I think if you see this, I would like you to understand why there are two classes with the same name, one external to the class and one internal. And I'd like you to be able to identify which one is being used and why. So I wanted to go into that. I hope that was kind of interesting. Are there any questions about what we're doing? Thank you for that one, Chung. I'm not sure I got complete answer on what your original question was.
Cause our org has a file that extends exception that's empty. So I was wondering why it's empty, but it does extend the exception class, which will be
Yep.
contained what's in the exception. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Perfect. Other questions, concerns? If not, I should definitely turn it over to Nadina, because I'm sure I've gone way over.
Yeah, we'll probably go over this class because I think we have about 15, but it's okay. If you need to drop, we'll continue recording. Let me share. Seeing my screen, yes. Perfect. Okay. So if we have no more questions for Bonnie, we'll move on to setting up our test data and minimizing the work that we need to do. So as Young pointed out, we can use test setup method where basically you have that data in that class and you can use the data that you're using there in each and every method. So every method will get to use that test data as you're running it. You can also use a factory where you have built-in data and calling that specific factory class, or you can load CSV data, or you can do the method that we've been doing where we're creating 1 or 2 records in the class for each method and then acting on those records. After each test, data is reset for the next test. So you always start with the same data state. So even if you've made some changes to the record, you've done inserts or updates, it rolls it back. And once you run that test again, it will run through what you've done. I'm going to skip over the @test setup because we'll look at this specifically in VS Code. So I'm just going to skip over this section. And when we go into VS Code, we'll talk through it specifically. But let's talk about CL data. Have we seen CL data? Have we used CL data? Is CL data good? I see a lot of head shaking. Yeah, CL data for the most part is really, really bad, like really bad. Like 10 times bad and then add 10 times more on top of it bad. There are very, very, very small use cases when you might need to use CL data. So one I could think of is if you're doing anything with the history tables, then you would actually have to use CL data. However, it is such a small use case that usually you can get around it by doing something calling mocking the data. And we can talk more about it, but it's basically anticipating what you think should happen and then calling that mock class to run your test against. But for the most part, as you can see from our friend here, we should not use CL data. Data changes in our org. It's very unpredictable. Every time you add CL data, you're literally looking at all the data in your orgs. For these small orgs that we have that are set up, small data set, but when you talk about the millions of records in your orgs, it's so much that like if you ever see your test classes running long, check and see if maybe you're using CL data, because I've heard of people where their orgs take 2 hours to run all their test classes. I've worked at orgs where it used to take 3 hours, and after rewriting the classes, we were down to 30 minutes, right? And so CL data is a very, very big component there. And as data changes, your test can actually start failing because now your data changed, you didn't update your test, the tests don't know that the data is changing. And so it's very dicey, very, very, very small use case when you should use it. But for the most part, we don't want to use CL data. So let's talk about test data factory versus CSV imports. I will call on, let me see, Natalie. Any benefits, or when would you use CSV versus a test data factory?
CSV, if you want to allow the front end users to be able to make updates to the data, since they can just load it to that static resource as a CSV document.
Yeah, exactly. You give that control to your users. You're not having to worry about it. So if they need something changed, they provide you the file and they can upload it themselves as well. Very good. And then let's see, Janae, when would we use test data factory?
I'm just going off of the slide here, but you would, okay, so I see test classes that contain methods to generate data for testing. Oh wait, maybe it's not telling you why, it's just saying how you would use it. Gives a centralized place to define what test records should look like. I'm guessing that you would use test data, a test data factory, if you want to generate a bunch of data really quickly and don't want to have the end user to have anything to do with it, but I really don't know.
No, that's really good. So imagine if say if you have tons of account logic and you have an account class, but then you're indirectly testing accounts for another class, maybe contacts, opportunity. You're building this data set over and over each time, and somebody changes a validation rule in your org. So you now have to go into every single class and change that data to match what the validation rule is saying. But if you had a test data factory, you could change it once. All your classes will fail the same way, but you have one point of failure. So that's a really good thing when it comes to test data factory. Everything is centralized. You have that one point of failure. Now you have that one point of failure, right? So when it goes down, all your test classes go down, but you're not changing it in 15 places. You're just changing it in one place. And then like Natalie pointed out, the business users are now in control of the data. So as things change, they pass you that CSV file, they update that CSV file. It helps you figure out bugs as well using that CSV file, because if that static data is failing, then it's either the code, something might be wrong there, something might have been missed that you're catching now in UAT, or realistically the data is being updated. And it also allows you to use production data without harming production data. So you literally could take, say, an export of your accounts, you put that in the static resource, but you're not having to turn on CL data to see this production data. You're just reading it directly from that CSV import. Okay, so I'm going to go into, let's see, and stop sharing. I'm going to attempt to share VS Code. Okay, I see the green box, so that means you can see as well. So let's look at the test factory that we had from, and this is directly from your Trailhead assignment. So we're gonna walk through this, and then I also have a quick little class that I created that's calling it so that we can see how we can use it throughout the org. So if we look at this first method, we have a get account, and we're passing some parameters. We're passing string name, and then we have a Boolean that's called do insert. It's very descriptive. So I'm imagining that if it's yes, an insert will happen. So let's read through the code. So we are seeing here, we have account A, not the best descriptive name, but we'll live with it for now. And we're saying create a new account. And this is a little tricky here because name is the actual account name, the field name. And then name here is the string that we're passing in. So we could have been more descriptive and we could have said string account name. So there's no confusion, but I just wanted to call that out. One's the field name and one's the actual name. And then we have an if statement. So if true, then we are inserting A. We have no false. And so then we return A. Similar, we have our contact, but with our get contact, we're passing in now an account ID. And then we got a little more descriptive with the string names, which is good. F name, L name, and then again, do insert. So we can see we're calling, we're creating that new contact, and then we're setting it based on the parameters that we're passing in and that account ID. And then we're also saying if do insert is true, then yes, create a contact. Notice also that these static methods, they're only creating one value, one account, one contact, and also returning it. Then we have generate account with contacts. So this one's a very good one because we're saying how many contacts do we need? We're going to create one account and we're just going to call it default account. And then we're going to loop through and create as many contacts for that account as we need. Similar with generate opportunities for accounts, where we're saying we're going to create. Here we're saying we need that account ID. We're setting an amount, and then we're setting the number of opportunities. So all the opportunities will have the same amount, same account ID. And we're just specifically saying how many opportunities we want. And then last but not least is this generate user one, where we're actually just creating our user role and then creating a new user. So I'm gonna open up my sample test class. And I'm gonna try to do side by side. And we're gonna push this out of the way so we have a little more space. Okay, hopefully you can see it okay. And I'll move the sample test one over a little bit. I just need to reference the test directory. So let's look at a little sample test that I created. So first thing I had in here actually is I was doing an add test setup. And this is a very vague class that I created, very descriptive, just sample test class. So if we look here, we're saying for this specific method, add test setup. So we know that this method is going to be a test method that we're using. So we're saying data creation. And what we're doing is we're just creating some accounts, but notice as we create our accounts, we're gonna call our test factory method. So we're using them in conjunction, which this isn't something you would always do, but I wanted to show you that you can also leverage your test factory to do it, where maybe you wanna specifically like you're setting up, but you already have accounts and contacts for your test factory. And for your opportunity, we specifically want some data here. So what we're going to say is we're going to say test factory.get account. We can do that because it's static. And then we're going to pass in the name of our account and we're going to say true, meaning I want to create that account. And then once we get that account, we'll have a account ID. So then we're going to, we're going to also create a contact. But for opportunity specifically here, instead of calling our opportunity or test factory opportunity method, we're going to actually create an opportunity the way that we've been doing it before, where we're just saying a new opportunity, we're specifically adding some values, and then we're inserting that opportunity. So now this data creation will be available for any method that we need in this sample test class. So you'll see here, the first thing I did was I'm going to test the call in that method. So I said list opportunity, select ID, account ID from opportunity. And then I'm using a system assert because I only created one opportunity. This is the only opportunity we have. So if I said check for 2, it would fail because there's only one. And we can run that one to see it pass. And I don't know if that just made the screen too wide. Apologies if it did. But if we open up and hopefully it is working today. See, there we go. So we have our green, that one passed beautifully and everything's working. Now, obviously in other tests, we would have more logic and more complexities, but this was just a simple way of showing that at test setup in conjunction with our test tree, where specifically it's a good use case if you're building specific data where accounts and contacts you're always creating, but maybe you have like a custom object or some custom logic that you specifically want to test and you don't want to have that in your test factory. But let us now go down to this other test where we're actually looking at creating accounts with contacts for a test factory. So we have list accounts, list contacts, and then all we're saying is generate accounts with contacts and we're passing 5. So what we did from our test factory there, if I just push this out of the way again, and we're going to just slide this over so we're in the same spot, is we're looking at our generate accounts with contacts, where we're going to have one specific account. And then we're saying, in this case, 5 contacts that we're adding to it. So what it's going to do is it's going to use our number 5. It's going to create an account called default account LTD, and then loop through, and it's going to make our contacts unique using the index. So we use the index for loop here, where we're saying number of contacts in this case, which is 5, and then we're just adding our contacts to this list, and we're calling that get contacts each time to create our contact. Now, some specific things we should call out here before I go back into the slides. So we did our list, we did our test factory to get our accounts, but then we started with this start test and stop test. Before I explain, I'm gonna call him Kavita. Kavita, do you know the purpose of start test and stop test?
It gives you a new set of limits within the start test and stop test.
Yes, exactly. So we're refreshing the limits that we have in between here. So when we call on our counts and we call on our contacts, we have that new fresh limits. So for example, if we were close to say hitting one of the DML limits, we would use the start test, stop test. Another reason why we use start test, stop test is when we're testing anything with cron jobs, when we're doing anything where we need to check if a job has run, you would put the job in between here, and then at the end you can test that it ran. So here we'll see that we're doing a system assert again, and we're asserting that the size is greater than 0, and then we're asserting that 5 contacts were created. So we know from this that we should have at least 1 account, and then we should have 5 contacts. So if we run this, and we have a failure, let's see why this failure happened. And I already know what the reason is, but before I call it out, let me just move this over here. So it said, was expecting to 5 contacts. Expected 5, actually got 6. Before I go through why this happens, can anyone tell me, just by looking at the code that we have here, why we're getting our system asserts not working correctly? Young, you want to take this one?
Yes, because the test, the record that you created in the test setup will be available during the life cycle of the test class.
Exactly. And so that's something when you're doing your system asserts, when you're mixing things like at test setup and test factory, you have to be very aware of is that I created this data creation. And in the data creation, I'm calling create accounts, create contacts. So it knows that throughout this test that we're running, that we're going to have more contacts available for us to use. So if I query the system right now, I wouldn't get just 5 contacts, I would get 6. Now, had I not had this data creation here, so I'm just going to comment this out and hit save. Should deploy automatically. Perfect. So if we run this again, and then we look at it, we should have gotten, yes, we should have gotten our green because now the code doesn't know about our data creation or at test setup. It's gone. We commented it out. And so realistically, the only contacts that it has to work on is the ones that we created when we said generate accounts with contacts, because we're only working on this method. But our test at test setup with data creation, it's available for every method that we have in our class. So I'm gonna switch back into the slides. Oh. And if you have any questions, when I go back into Visual Studios, we can go over them. So now we're going to talk about how we can handle tests that, how can you test the code that handles errors well? I'm going to speak today. So bulk testing and limits in tests. So specifically, we talked about start tests and stop tests, about resetting our limits. And then we also want to ensure that our code is bulkified, because as we're testing, we don't want to test for one, we want to test for multiple. So getting past the limits where it's 200 or any of those limits, it's always good to test in bulk. And negative tests. We always want to make sure that our code can handle not just the good things, but the bad things, right? So even as developers, when we get our use cases, we always have to assume that our users are not always going to follow our happy path. They're going to always do something different. And so we have to make sure that your code can handle this, it can handle boundaries. And so, you know, if it's supposed to expect a number, what happens if you put in a double? Or if it's supposed to do number, what happens if a string is put in? And we can do that by using try catch finally, which Bonnie talked about a little bit, and I'll also talk about now. And try catch is really good because there's many catch exceptions. So in this example, we're just looking at the generic exception, but there's many try catch exceptions that you can use as you're going through your code to make sure that you're handling all your use cases. And so if we look at this try catch block, it starts with a try, and you put in the code that you're trying to throw an error on. So it might be an insert, inserting a record, and then our catch will validate that we caught the right exception. And we'll go into this example once we go back into Visual Studio. So how can we test that the code is working for different users? And I'll call on pinging for this one.
Set a user profile.
Kinda, almost, but maybe Natalie can help out here.
You run as like as a profile or somebody specifically, I guess.
Yeah. So Yeah, so specifically in Apex, it's called the system.run as user. And what we can do here is if we have a specific user, maybe we're testing for support and we want to make sure our support user or that user who has the support profile is getting the correct permissions in this case. So you see here, we had our test factory that we had and we generate our standard user and then we can run as that user. So in this case, we're testing, we're doing a permission set test and we're testing to make sure that that user doesn't have permission to see the records. So we use system.run as. We have the object in mind where it's a private object. And then we're using our test.start test. We're going to do a query, and then we're going to do our system.assert. So we're just making sure that as we're building our code, right, we're building for different personas, different users. We also need to test for these different personas, these different users. Okay, I'm gonna hop back into Visual Studios again. I haven't figured out how to share. So let's see. For this one, we're going to open up our ingredient utility. I don't know why sometimes my Visual Studio does this. Go back. There we go. And let us look at some try-catch logic in here. So let's specifically look at the test.doChecker method because that one has specific try-catch. So right now we're catching for a exception E and we're checking for a DML exception. So let's see what happens if it wasn't in this try-catch. So I'm gonna take it out so that we can see the error. I'm gonna comment. Save and deploy. And I'm expecting this to fail. Let us run tests on just the doCheck method. Move this over. There we go. And so if we open up this error, we move this out of the way. So you'll see that it's throwing that field custom validation. There's already an ingredient with that name for this recipe. And so what we're doing with our try catch is we're specifically catching that DML exception. So if I revert the code, and we run again, we should get a successful run. One thing I want us to also be mindful of, I don't see this often, but sometimes you will see where people have done the try, done the catch, and then there's nothing in it. So they've forgotten this line completely. Not sure why I've seen it out in the wild, but I just want to show you what happens when you run the test. It won't fail because essentially it's waiting for you to put that information in. Doesn't happen often, but when you're first creating that try catch, obviously it's going to be empty and it's waiting for you to fill it in, but you want to do something with that catch. You want to have that system assert or system debug to find out what the error is. So just be mindful when you're setting this up that if you forget to fill out this area and you leave it blank, it's not going to fail. And so I've seen the best of code where there's no error being thrown, but obviously the code is failing in production. And it's literally because when you debug, you're not getting an error, but you check the try catch and someone just might have simply forgotten to put in that system debug or a system assert so that it can fail. So just be mindful of that when you're going through and you're setting up these try catches. I'm gonna pause and ask if we have any questions here. Or if there was any questions on the other part. I know I went through a little fast. I just wanted to make sure we got back into Visual Studio. So if you have any questions on the other part as well. I'm going to take silence as no questions.
So what error though is it going to throw right now? Would it not throw that same error?
Oh,
Since you're just
how I
doing
have
email
this.
it.
Yeah, so how I have the code right now, there won't be, it's going to throw a system.dml because that was the error we were expecting. So the class will pass and this assert will pass because it's the assert's just checking that the error that get type name has in a system.dml exception.
So yes, silly question. What am I going to see on the front end as a user if there is a validation rule that I can't have duplicates?
You would see the validation rule.
I would still see the validation. Okay, so on the front end, I would still see.
Yeah,
that.
you would see
Okay.
what I think the validation rule was like you couldn't have
Yeah, I would still see that same
ingredients.
error that popped up on our error log here when this test class did
Correct.
pass. It's just this test class can't pass because we didn't do have the assertion.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. Okay.
Great question. Any other questions? Okay, I'll switch back to the slides, and then if you still have any questions, we're here. All right, one more time switching. Okay. And we'll be talking about homework. I think I already have it open. Week 6, yes. So let me just do the high level first. So high level homework we're doing is we're going to be adding on. So we'll be writing negative tests and writing permission-based tests, and then we'll be adding on negative tests for a recipe utility. Let's just go in and see. So we're going to be doing some more of that trailhead that we were looking at. So the negative test section and then the permission-based test section. And for your practice, what you'll be doing is using your same recipe utility test class that you did last week. And then you will just be adding negative tests to it. So write at least one test method that validates your code doesn't do something it shouldn't, but could if your code was sloppy or missing a requirement. So for example, what happens if that user, it's a number field, but they have a double, right? Or if it's supposed to take text and we send a number. And then exception testing, if your requirements change, which they always do, what we're doing here is instead of marking our recipe as a draft when it's missing a required field, we want to try an error instead. So we're going to look at the add ingredient utility that was in that add error in the ingredient utility. And we're going to be adding an error. You could do it declaratively. You could do a validation rule, but the purpose here is to actually try it out in Apex using the add error and see how it goes. And also we'll be writing test methods that verify an exception is thrown, hint, hint, what Bonnie showed us earlier, and then also using tries and catches and assertions like I just showed as well. And then we want to make sure our tests pass in VS Code or if you do it in Dev Console. And then for our reading next week, we'll be talking about asynchronous processes. So we want you to read on asynchronous processing basics. I'm gonna stay on this page for a little bit. Do we have any questions on what we should be doing for next week? And of course, if anything's not clear, you can always message us if you don't have any questions. And I did want to give everyone the heads up that next week we'll start talking about the final project. And I believe next week, either we start to talk about it and we give it to you, or we give it to you the week before, but start thinking of the pairs that you're going to want to work in. And in the homework tracker for week 9, I added one more column called groups. So if you're thinking of pairs that you already want to working, you can just call yourself group 1 or group 2 for now. So you can start thinking of pairing yourselves up. I know everyone's not here, so we'll talk about it again next class.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. This month, thank you, Young. I put it on Twitter too. This month is free plural sites. So take advantage, skill up, tons of classes, Bonnie's classes on there. So really have a listen. There's a lot of good play-by-plays as well. So lots of good Salesforce material for the month of April that you can listen to for free.
One thing I found I had to do is create a new login because I had done it last year. And when I logged in with my last year's, it was wanting me to upgrade.
Oh,
So I had to use it, I did like my work email instead this time, and then everything's showing as free. So
nice.
Heads up in case.
Good there. Thank you, Natalie.
Yeah.
And yeah, Bonnie just dropped her class in there. It's a really good class. You can take a look at. But yeah, really take advantage of the free plural sites as well for April. It's a really good resource. I don't think I missed anything. One thing I'll say is apologies if you were looking for the recording last week. For some reason, it didn't upload and I didn't notice it until Sunday. So then I uploaded it. So apologies. I'll make sure to double check that it actually makes it to your folder. Apparently, it just made it to my computer and it did not sync over. So apologies there if you were looking for it and it wasn't there. It's there as of yesterday, and I'll make sure that it makes it there today. But with that, have a great week. Have a fun time testing if you don't have any questions, and we can also stick around for a little bit more. And apologies, we went over a little bit again today, but yeah, you have the recording.
And thanks for hanging in there.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Good one.
Thanks, everyone.